We're going to take a piece of your intestine and make a vagina with that. Do you see me blinking right now? Because it's so ridiculous. All right, so we have this situation that we absolutely have to discuss. And I'm going to make a very, very, very bold comparison here that even people on the conservative side might be uncomfortable with. But I'm going to go there. And we're talking about transgenderism yet again. We have to talk about this because it just continues to be absolutely insane and evil and crazy. 18-year-old boy died after doctors tried to create a vagina from part of his colon. Okay? Tell me this isn't butchery. Tell me this isn't some kind of like Frankenstein experimentation going on. All right, this is out of the UK. It says a disturbing story from the UK reveals that a trans-identified teenager died from complications that arose from a surgery in which doctors tried to build him a vagina using parts of his colon. A 2016 medical article reveals details about an 18-year-old boy's death due to complications that arose from a gender-affirming surgery, as reported by the Post-Millennial. This paper was part of a linchpin Dutch study that laid the groundwork for child sex change operations. The boy was given puberty blockers at a young age because he claimed he was truly a girl. It doesn't say how young this person was, but puberty blockers would indicate maybe 9, 10, 11 years old. These medications resulted in a lack of penile tissue developing in his body, which was the reason that surgeons removed a part of his colon in order to perform a vaginoplasty, a surgery that essentially attempts to create a neo-vagina in male patients. Okay. So you wonder what can happen when we decide that a child can determine and give consent to sex change anything, be it hormone blockers, a social transition, or surgery. This is what happens when we remove logic and common sense and goodness and discernment of evil from the conversation. Those things done left the chat a long time ago. But here we have a child who was experimented on by his medical care team. Care, I use loosely. But they said, oh, okay, you're really a girl. Here's some hormones. We're going to pump your body full of hormones. We don't want you to eat chickens that have hormones, but we'll give you hormones so that you can become something that you're not. And then they try to make a neo-vagina, but instead of realizing that the hormone blockers created a situation in which there's not enough tissue to create a fake vagina with, we're going to take a piece of your intestine and make a vagina with that. Do you see me blinking right now? Because it's so ridiculous. Okay, so let's continue. The patient was described as a healthy teenager, but within 24 hours of the surgery, he experienced necrotizing fasciitis, a rare bacterial infection that can spread quickly in the body and result in death. Doctors attempted to save him by administering IV antibiotics and repeated surgical debridement, which removes dead or infected tissue. But multiple of his organs went into failure and he died. Further investigation showed that the patient suffered a deadly strain of E. coli that likely originated from his own intestines. Okay, so I said I was going to make a bold statement. What is this comparison that you're not allowed to do, whether you're on the left side of the aisle or the right side of the aisle, is to compare anything to Nazism. Actually, well, the left does it all the time, but you know what I mean. The right is uncomfortable sometimes with this comparison. But the medical decisions that were made in this case, where we decided to play Frankenstein with a child, and then as soon as they turn 18, we continue the Frankenstein experimentation and say, well, the hormones we did, didn't quite work out. So we're going to have to take your intestine and create a vagina from it. Like, the medical guideline guiding this type of incompetence and evil, profit-driven mentality at the expense of common sense and reason and logic and love and taking care of humans and wanting them to be better. So this originates, I know that was long-winded, but this originates from WPATH. What is WPATH? Okay, so after that Frankenstein-esque story that is underpinned with gender ideology seeping through its pores and leading to the death of a young person who spent his life confused, and the confusion being fed by medical professionals. A lot of these medical professionals are referring to a set of guidelines known as WPATH, and right now they're on version 8, which came out in 2022. My comparison that tends to be controversial is I am saying that the same level of evil that is happening in this experimentation that we're conducting on children in our time, what these medical professionals are doing are on the same level of evil as the doctors who were conducting experiments in Nazi camps. There was a trial called the Nuremberg trials that happened to these doctors after the whole thing blew up in their face. And the United States held a tribunal court over this and held them to 10 ethical standards regarding human experimentation. Now, these standards, in my personal opinion, are being violated by WPATH. So right now, when you see Boston Children's, those doctors proudly coming out and saying that they are providing oophorectomies and mastectomies on who we can assume minors, right? Because they're being seen at Boston Children's Hospital, right? And many more. This happened in Tennessee and other places, but they are referring to something that is violating the Nuremberg Code. Okay? Now, this person is pointing out what's wrong with version 8. It's using ideologically driven language. So it says here, the guidelines feature language based in ideology rather than medicine or biology throughout. Do you hear that craziness? Rather than referring to science as we supposedly care about all the time, we're just going to disregard that because we have an ideology to work on here, and we're going to call it gender affirming care. And we're going to call double mastectomies chest masculinization surgery. And then he goes on to say ideological terms such as cisgender is used, as well as scientifically and factually inaccurate term sex assigned at birth. If you haven't heard of any of these terms, consider yourself lucky but underinformed, because this is happening, and we're seeing this play out in culture too. We're seeing these words like gender affirming when we're talking about pronouns. Also, cisgender is the term for people who are not transgender. So everyone else who doesn't have this sickness going on, we have a new term that we have to abide by now too. All right, he goes on to talk about the removal of minimum ages for irreversible medicalization. The standard does not place any weight on nuanced concern for the welfare and well-being of vulnerable children. It does not consider that gender dysphoria is a mental health symptom, and many young people have comorbidities such as autism and mental health diagnoses. Guys, this should blow your mind right now, because it's blowing my mind right now. They removed minimum ages for these procedures, and they're not considering gender dysphoria as a mental health problem. Instead, it's an identity. I identify as X, Y, and Z gender, and therefore in the medical community that follows this guideline, no, you don't have a problem. You really are that thing. So long as you've reached what it says here, Tanner stage 2 of puberty, which can be as young as 9 years old. That's crazy. Tell me this isn't echoes of the Nazi Party right now. It states that double mastectomies, euphemistically called chest masculinization surgery, can be considered in minors, and equally, vaginoplasty, which was the surgery that this 18-year-old that died had, can also be considered for people under 18 years old. Tell me this isn't in violation of the Nuremberg Code. Then we have chest binding and genital tucking for children. Healthcare professionals are instructed to provide education on chest binding and genital tucking on the basis that this will provide comfort and lower rates of misgendering. There's a lot of air quotes going on if you haven't noticed. But chest binding can cause pain, infection, and even fractures, and the tucking can cause decreased sperm concentration. Number 4, and the most startling, alienation of parents. Healthcare professionals are advised to challenge parents who are unsupportive of their child medically transitioning. Equally, they are recommended to prescribe hormone treatment for children without parental involvement. Without parental involvement. If involvement would be considered harmful or unnecessary. And to further this point, there is a bill right now coming out of, I believe, Washington. You can look it up online and see the details for yourself. But essentially, a child can be removed from the home if the parents are unsupportive of medical interventions for their so-called transgender child. So here you are, doctors are being instructed to challenge these parents. And if you live in certain states, you might lose your kids over this. Or all you got to do is get a hysterectomy. And you'll never have babies. Because men can't have babies. Oh, but they can, but they can't, but they can, but they can't. None of it makes sense. It's all devoid of scientific reality. Abandonment of mental health safeguarding. These guidelines explicitly state that therapy or counseling should, quote unquote, never be mandatory before prescribing irreversible medication or surgery, including for children. So you don't even have to go through, intensive therapy or counseling first, because we don't need that. We know what your identity is because you said your identity is this, and we're ready to cut your boobs off. We're ready to inject you with hormones that will stop your penis from growing. It's a sickness. All of the above is recommended, notwithstanding the fact that WPATH acknowledges that the number of studies is still low and that there are few outcome studies that follow youth into adulthood, and that no clinical studies have reported on profiles of adolescents who regret their initial decisions. That's got to be the most sickening part of this, is that they're not even operating on evidence-based logic. They do not care about the detransitioners, the people who mutilated themselves as children and are coming out and saying, oh my God, I've made a huge mistake. This was totally wrong. Nobody counseled me. They just threw me into these surgeries. This was a mistake. They're not even considering those people. So when I say it violates the Nuremberg Code, I am specifically referencing 2 different ideas that were explicitly outlined in the Nuremberg Code. And that is, number 1, informed consent. At no point, if you are suffering from gender dysphoria as a child, can you really actually say that you are 100% certain that you're the opposite sex and that these medical treatments are appropriate for your age. You cannot say that. No child can consent to the effects of what those hormones are doing to their bodies. How can they possibly know when they can't even drive properly They can't drink alcohol. They can't do all the things that you should be able to do at 18 or up, sometimes 21. You can't even rent a car until you're 25 for insurance purposes. They're also not breaking down all the things that can happen. So that leads to a lack of informed consent. You're not informed. So not only can you not consent, but you're not informed of the actual harm and risks that are associated with what is being recommended. So then we have the other principle that's being violated here, and that is the principle of non-maleficence. And what that means is do no harm. You can't tell me that these doctors are operating when you violate the principle of informed consent and you're doing these procedures that are not evidence-based, that you do not have studies to help you set a precedent, when you're using ideological language instead of medical language because you don't want to offend people, you are violating this principle of do no harm. It's part of the Hippocratic Oath. I think it's really fair to say that the darkness that underpinned the Nazi experimentation in the camps is the same darkness we're seeing with these doctors who are making these decisions knowingly about children and killing them when their Frankenstein experiments go inevitably wrong.